night at the museum. I am Professor Toby Ault. I'm a climate scientist at Cornell University. And today's lecture is going to be called Apocalypse Now and Then, because we're going to be looking at the Permian extinction, which has some important lessons for the environmental changes we've seen in recent decades and within the last century right here on planet Earth. The picture here is not my own picture, sadly. It's of Yoggins Cliffs, which is in Nova Scotia. And I wish it were my own picture because from, I think, about the year 2015 onward, I had planned, if I got tenure at Cornell University, and when I turned 40, I was going to go there, I was going to walk along Yoggins Cliffs, which are this incredible formation that spans hundreds of million, 100 million years of time, from the rocks that are farthest away in that picture to the ones that are closest to us, from left to right. So you can walk along this trail of several kilometers along the waterfront there, and it's like you're walking through time. And I thought, what better way to welcome myself into middle age when I turned 40 than to go to this place and camp there. And I turned 40 in the summer of 2020, and there was no going anywhere. So I still haven't been to Yoggins Cliffs, but it's on my bucket list. In this particular formation, you will find a layer corresponding to the Permian, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. And you'll also find a layer corresponding to the Carboniferous, which we're also going to talk about tonight. And as you get closer and closer to the right here, you get closer and closer to modern day. Now, you may notice that the formation is not layered in a normal stratigraphic sequence from top to bottom along nice horizontal lines. And that's because of plate tectonics, folding and lifting has caused this whole bed, which was once stacked like layers of a cake on top of itself, to shift, and then erosion has taken away the top layer. So it presents this very clean walk through time. This is a picture I took from the Adirondacks. And if you've been to the Adirondacks, maybe you've seen places where there seem to be these large, inexplicable patches of dead trees that have been there for a long time. They've lost all their bark. They're these pale white trees. And some, not all of them, are the remnants of a pretty serious environmental catastrophe or environmental hazard that was unfolding last century and still is a problem in parts of the world, where acid rain from industrial pollutants was causing the soils, the streams, the environment in the Adirondacks and many other natural areas across the Northeast, across the world, to deteriorate. Here you can see the effects of acid rain on a limestone gargoyle. If you walk through the cemetery here, just behind the high school, you know, where one puts a cemetery, right behind the high school, between Cornell and the high school, you'll see older gravestones that are made out of limestone have been eroded away, dissolved away from acid rain during the 60s and 70s. And it was in the 60s when some fairly successful business people, things like Mad Men era, people were going back to where they'd gone in the 1930s to fish and to hunt up in the Adirondacks and the Catskills, and the forest looked completely different. There were dead and dying trees, the trout had been stunted, and they funded research. It was done in part in Cornell University to try to figure out what was going on. They pinned it down to acid rain from industrial pollutants, particularly from burning coal, which has a lot of sulfur. The less pure the coal is, the more dirty the coal, the more industrial pollutant, the sulfur dioxide it has. That combines with water, rains out as acid rain. I've experienced this myself in an extreme case, sulfur dioxide from a volcano. When I was 13 years old, living in Costa Rica, we were visiting Volcan Arenal, and there was sulfur dioxide being emitted, apparently, from the volcano. We couldn't see the top of the volcano, and it was combining with droplets in the clouds. And we're in a group, my father was on his sabbatical there, and he was taking a group of teachers, actually, out into the field to look at this geologically interesting event happening in real time. And one of them's like, oh my gosh, something's biting me. It felt like their skin was stinging. And then they noticed there's holes that were forming in their shirt, and it was from the acid rain. We're going to talk about the Permian extinction. And if we compress the history of the Earth into a 24-hour timescale, so we start at the formation of the solid crust of the Earth at exactly 12 a.m. this morning. And we imagine that right now it is just right before midnight, so the whole day has gone by. The Permian extinction happens at 10:39 p.m., so just in the last hour and a half of the day. You'll see, if you wander around the museum, and you already have seen, evidence of abundant form of life called trilobites. They're featured prominently in earlier periods before the Permian. They had a good run of tens of millions of years, and they went extinct along with many other species during the Permian. In fact, something like 83% of all genera went extinct during the Permian. This estimate has been used to then break down how this played out on land versus in the oceans. And it was particularly devastating in the oceans, where something like as much as 96% of marine species, at least marine species that we knew about, went extinct during this time period. 70% of terrestrial species, 50% of all biological families. So what's going on and what's relevant for today? Are there some connections to what's happening in the Permian to what's happening now, and potentially some warning lessons? And how can we use the Permian extinction, the world's biggest extinction so far, to help us understand the pace and the magnitude of climate change that's unfolding right now? To do that, we're going to rely on paleoclimate. So I got my PhD at the University of Arizona in 2011. I was there from 2004 through 2011. And I worked in a lab that was a carbonate lab doing high-resolution paleoclimatology, so much shorter, much more recent timescales. I thought I was going to get to do a bunch of field work and go scuba diving in the tropical Pacific. Turns out, because I was a math major, I was hired into that lab to do the data analysis part, which I also very much enjoyed. It didn't feel quite as glamorous as going out and doing the coring of the corals and even some of the restoration work that some of my colleagues would eventually get to do. One of them is Diane Thompson, who gave a wonderful talk in our department last year and is now the director of marine sciences at the Biosphere 2 facility in the University of Arizona. And she does this work. So if you have any questions that I can't answer about paleoclimate, I will direct you to her, because she's a real rock star of this high-resolution paleoclimate approach and the approach of using carbonates to infer something about the Earth's past. So we've got here our cores from the deep ocean. Now, we're going to look at data from cores that are probably not from the deep ocean, but are from sediments on land that were once in the deep ocean. And inside these sediment cores, you can think of these as like very, very thin layers of mud that are laid down incredibly slowly, almost at like the rate that dust accumulates. So even just a millimeter of sample could correspond to a century or even a millennium. But inside those layers of mud, we have microorganisms called foraminifera. And they're surface foraminifera, they're benthic or bottom-dwelling foraminifera. They are the superheroes of the paleoclimate world, because these calcium carbonate skeletons, the shells that they put on, record something important about ambient seawater. And they can tell us about the isotopes, or think of it as like the varieties or the different flavors of carbon and oxygen that was in the ocean at the time that these organisms were growing. And we can use that information about the different flavors of oxygen, the different flavors of carbon, to tell us more about what the environment was like, and also what changed during the Permian in this case. And the way that we do that uses mass spectrometry, but just a quick refresher on what I'm calling the different flavors. So there's like the carbon-12, that's like the light, it's like Coca-Cola Light, low sugar. That's the carbon-12, that's the lighter isotope of carbon. And then there's the heavy carbon, that's like got the corn syrup in it. And that's got an extra neutron, so its mass is slightly greater than the carbon-12. Those are just two naturally occurring flavors of carbon that occur in the world. And in general, calcium carbonate organisms that are, when they're building their shells, or even calcium carbonate when it precipitates naturally, quote unquote, prefers the lighter isotope, the lighter flavor, prefers Coca-Cola Light. And the reason is because it's easier to grab onto. And as temperatures heat up, it's even harder to grab onto the heavy isotope because it's moving around. And we can use that relationship of the heavy and the light isotope in a mass spectrometer And again, I used a mass spectrometer when I was in graduate school. Not very well, I will say. I did some calcium carbonate work on cave formations, but I didn't have a compelling enough result to be able to publish on it. But it was still a lot of fun to be at the lab late at night, loading up little samples. These are tiny samples. You'd spend the day using a micro mill. Like you had a computer program that would drill at maybe 100 micron resolution through the carbonate material. Get just almost an infinitesimally small layer of this white powder. It was always fun when you had lines of white powder on your desk, and then like the building inspection would come in and look at you sort of sideways. Like, it's not what you think. Might have to fix this in post for the teachers. And their students. Especially their students. Don't do drugs, do science. Okay, we've cleared that one up. So you take these calcium carbonate samples, load them up, and there's a tray that rotates through, drops the sample into a small bath of warm acid. The acid almost instantly dissolves the calcium carbonate into a gas. The CO2 gas is then ionized by stripping away an electron and sent through an ion beam around a very powerful magnet. And the momentum, if you think about the momentum of the light versus the heavy flavors of isotopes, is going to mean that the heavier molecules, the heavier isotopes, are going to end up on the outside. The lighter ones are going to end up on the inside. And so you have a collector at the end of your mass spectrometer that just counts the collisions, the number of molecules hitting it. And from that relationship between the heavy and the light collisions on the left and the right there, we're able to infer the relative concentration of the heavy isotope with respect to the light isotope. We express that using what's called delta notation. So delta 13C is the ratio of our sample compared to some standard whose absolute measurements are known, all normalized by that standard. For the graph that we're about to show, the important part here is that if there is a more depleted signal of carbon-13 with respect to carbon-12, that suggests that there's higher atmospheric, or in the case of the oceans, higher dissolved carbon in the oceans. Higher atmospheric CO2 is going to correspond to more depleted. Higher atmospheric CO2, more enriched delta 13C is going to correspond to lower CO2 in the atmosphere. All right, so here it is. This is a really significant, important result from just a few years ago. It's really exciting to be in a field where I have to update my slides right, every few years because there's still so much active research. In this particular period, the Permian gets a lot of attention because of its potential relevance and the lessons that it holds for today. This paper was a big deal when it came out and still remains one of the more compelling papers because they were able to put some real quantitative estimates on what unfolded during the Permian. So on the left, we have this measure of delta 13C from carbonate. So this is from the marine samples. They looked at the calcium carbonate shells of the living organisms that were alive at the time in the oceans. They looked at the carbon-13 and delta 13C of plant material as well. They looked at stomata as well as charcoal and non-charcoal wood. And then they used the oxygen isotopes, which also follow a similar pattern where there's like a light flavor of oxygen and a heavy flavor of oxygen. And they use that to infer temperatures, changes in sea surface temperature. And this paper was pretty significant because it was able to pin down that there had been a 6-fold increase in carbon dioxide, inferred both from the marine records as well as the terrestrial records, a 10-degree increase in temperatures using marine foraminifera, and because they had really precise, really high-resolution data by geologic standards, high resolution meaning thousands of years, they were able to pin down that this unfolded over the course of about 75,000 years. So if we compare that to today's rates of change, again, I just had to update this because we are continuing to see an increase in the rate of change, or in the emissions each year. There are about 35 gigatons of CO2, more than 35 gigatons of CO2 going into the atmosphere from human sources of emissions over the last, say, decade or so. Last year's number, I think, was closer to 37 gigatons of CO2. If we compare that to the Permian, it's several orders of magnitude lower in the Permian. So this is the worst mass extinction event in history, had emissions of CO2 that were lower by several orders of magnitude than the rate at which we are emitting CO2 right now. And the CO2 emissions from that time were driven primarily by volcanism. Specifically, you have a situation in what is present-day Siberia, where the continents are moving around and they're being ripped apart. You can see this process happening even today in parts of Africa, where you have what's called continental rifting. Two different parts of the continent are going in different directions. In an area that is now called the Siberian Traps, present-day Siberia, two different plates were moving in different directions. They opened up fissures that allowed lava to pour out onto the surface. And as it just so happened, that lava sat right on top of massive coal deposits. This is like the original burning of fossil fuels. Coal deposits that had built up over millions of years were ignited by the lava, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere and triggering a whole series of nonlinear biogeochemical feedbacks. Igniting the coal released more CO2. It also released sulfur dioxide, which creates acid rain. That damaged plants, led to many plants going extinct or being less productive. It damaged the ozone layer, which damaged plants even further. Plants being at the base of the food chain meant that animals that ate plants had less to eat, and the animals that ate other animals had less to eat. The ocean circulation changed and slowed down and probably favored the production of even more sulfur dioxide. CO2, when it gets into the atmosphere, even today, about half of it is absorbed by the oceans. It's fair to assume that something similar would have happened during the Permian. The oceans became increasingly more acidic. As they became more acidic, it made it harder and harder for microorganisms to survive. That affected the food chain in the marine ecosystems, and you see this, what's called the Great Dying, unfolding across almost every ecosystem and almost every living form at the time during the Permian being wiped out by processes that are analogous to what we've been doing for the last century or two. And that's why this interval, in spite of being 252 millions of years ago, is still very relevant for today. Like all good geologists would like to say, the past is always with us. The past is with us in the present. And the lessons from the past are very relevant for thinking about how we're going to create a future that we want to live in. So I'll end there. If you've got any questions, you can ask them now. Otherwise, you can wander around. We're going to do a 10-minute break, and then we're going to do the next lecture. And then, after the next lecture, we take all the chairs, and we're going to move to the part of the museum where, if you see it, there's a stegosaurus and also a velociraptor with its head sticking out of the wall. So I'll be lecturing next to the velociraptor. We're going to do one more up here, and then we're going to move everything downstairs to in front of the velociraptor. Thank you. All right. I'm just going to keep this one rolling, I think, so that we get the audio. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes. 10-minute break.